As I was reading the story, I could tell that my overall assessment of the story was going to depend on the final confrontation and the wider implications of everything that unfolded. Yeah, that's not a shocker, right? Obviously. I knew Kellis would fail, if only because people mentioned that the book was ballsy and pessimistic. So that wasn't what I was worried about. What I cared about was the how. And Bakker did not disappoint. If this was the absolute end, then I might have had problems with some of the open ends, but the revelations that did come along were excellent. The first revelation is the fact that the Inkoroi were no different from the Srank, that they were not naturally occurring creatures, but were created by something greater to serve a purpose. I never considered this, but I love the implication. The Inkoroi were set up throughout the series as this mysterious alien race with some queer purpose. But the mystery is then kicked up a step to the Ark itself. Because the Ark itself, it turns out, is a kind of artificial intelligence that is orchestrating everything. As before, I did not guess this, yet it follows so naturally from what we already know. The Inkoroi and their techne seems to be a strictly scientific materialist view of life, all to such an extent that they consider living creatures to be highly complex machines. Indeed, they can even create life from scratch and then craft them for a particular purpose. That artificial intelligence is at the core of this is such a natural development. What is funny is that it never occurred to me while reading that this implied something beyond the Ark. Who created the Ark, or how it was created? This is not something covered in the Unholy Consult, but it is absolutely worth asking. Maybe the implications are not as important as we think. Maybe the Ark is operating independent of its creators. Or maybe it was created for some purpose involving a war against what are considered to be the gods. Before I started reading this book, I briefly considered and then dismissed the possibility that the gods were really just aliens and that they were in war with the Inkoroi, and vice versa. I can't remember why I ultimately dismissed this, but if it does become true, then perhaps the Ark is something that was created as part of this war. Maybe this anticipates too much information from Bakker. He likes to keep things ambiguous, so maybe the Ark won't ever be explained. Maybe the thematic implications of it being AI are more important. I guess we will have to see. A quick addendum, something that I just considered, are the implications of AI and the soul. The suggestion does seem to be that human beings have souls in this story, and I discussed in prior reviews about how the no-god is a philosophical zombie, this accounting for why the gods can't see it. But it also occurred to me that the Ark's AI might also be invisible to the gods, but for a different reason. I mean, the Ark also lacks a soul, but the reason is less that the Ark is a physical copy of a human being. It's more a metallic machine that is alive. If the gods are indeed blind to the Ark as an AI, this would be another interesting way in which Bakker is playing around with consciousness. The next major revelation is one that I failed to guess. I was actually mixed on the implications at the outset, though I am positive on them now. Because the consult attacked the Dunyain and destroyed their home of Ishwal, they took some of the monks prisoner. Bad idea. And naturally, the consult was then enslaved and taken over by the Dunyain. Who would have guessed? I was initially mixed because I was so excited to see the Inkoroi versus Dunyain conflict that had been hyped up until now. You know, I remember that scene where Nair was talking with the consult and they laughed off Kellis and his power, only to be chastised by the barbarian for underestimating such a terrifying power. Who would have guessed that the Dunyain, people fighting against the apocalypse, would be even more terrifying than the apocalypse itself? But it didn't take me long to realize that this twist actually is a confirmation of Nair's warning. And the consult and the Inkoroi are not the same thing anyway, so whatever. In any case, this is another twist that feels so natural. When Kellis revealed his suspicions, his reasoning made the development seem so obvious. How could it not happen? But of course I didn't guess it. A great twist. The great ordeal seems to point the reader toward thinking that even the Dunyain have a nature that drives them, and this is to master and dominate their circumstances so they can attain the Logos. By using reason, they are able to understand how things, and especially people, work. And by understanding what comes before, then one can control what comes after. In other words, the Dunyain are no different than Srank, which are programmed to murder, molest, and masticate the flesh of humanity. They simply follow a different programming. But Bakker does not stop there. He spins this in a number of different and interesting ways. The first has to do with Kellis's motivations. As I mentioned before, there is a question of why Kellis wants to stop the apocalypse at all, particularly if he killed his father, knowing the man would side with the Consult because of his Dunyan nature. Bakker provides his answer. Kellis is trying to master circumstances just like any other Dunyan, but his contingencies have led him to conclude that the best way to do this is to master hell itself, instead of trying to cut humanity off from it. Kellis is in opposition to the Consult because he thinks the response to the reality of damnation is best mastered by enslaving hell, and the afterlife as a whole, and even the gods themselves. If the gods are just aliens, or if the nature of the afterlife is something more complicated than the typical Christian assumptions, then this would provide an avenue for Kellis to do this. I just love how neatly this accounts for everything. Bakker truly did think this through. But, even better, I think my favorite aspect of the final confrontation has to be how Dunyan philosophy was reinterpreted in response to different developments. As Kellis points out, they each had different contingencies upon entering the world and exposing themselves to everything that Dunyan were ignorant of. This started in the Great Ordeal, where Kellis's full-blooded son is exposed to the judging eye. He quickly reinterprets Dunyan philosophy, such that the Logos was understood to be the judging eye, rather than a passive principle or an active god. And because the judging eye was the ultimate measure of all things, it has profound implications, including the suggestion that the Dunyan had gone completely wrong. Bakker continues this by showing that there are two other potential pathways that a Dunyan can follow based on the contingencies they come into contact with. For the Dunyan that took control of the Consult, they concluded that the Techne, the strange technology and the underlying materialist philosophy, was the basis for the real Logos. As Kellis points out, instead of using reason and the Logos as a principle to master causality, they concluded that all things in reality, including reason itself, was just a mechanism of the causal order. In order to attain the Logos, they must take advantage of the reality that all is just machine. The Ark seems to be a tool, a mechanism in reality that they can then use to master the situation they find themselves in with the gods. Closing off the world from the outside is now the new goal in the manner in which they will master their circumstances. But then there is a third way, and that is Kellis's way. Kellis points out that his contingency was not the Techne, or the judging eye for that matter, but the Gnosis and later the Deimos. I'll admit that how this particular path works is not clear overall. I wish Bakker would have explained it more. I don't know why Kellis mentioned the Gnosis. I do understand why he mentioned the Deimos, as the Deimos is all about enslaving entities in hell. The problem arises from the fact that the Gnosis was the focus of the story and the Deimos was barely mentioned at all. I only understand the latter because of the appendix. Either way, the idea is that through the Deimos, Kellis understood that he could master hell itself by enslaving it. So his reinterpretation of the Logos seems to be involving something from the Deimos and the Gnosis too? Setting aside the vagueness, the general idea communicated here, that there are different historically contingent reinterpretations of the Dunyan philosophy, is such a fascinating concept to me. It reminds me of the social constructionist accounts of science. Basically, in philosophy of science, there are different interpretations of the scientific process, and the conclusions that it produces, suggesting they are not as absolute as some scientists would have you believe. If we rewound the clock and tweaked a variable here and there, we might have a very different view of reality that is as imperfect as it is now under quantum mechanics. Basically, we don't have it all figured out. There's still these mysteries, and perhaps these mysteries would have been very different under a different timeline. And this relates rather subtly to some of my speculation in the Great Ordeal review about the nature of the judging eye. There, I had considered that the eye might be reinterpreted such that it is not actually the basis of justice, but merely reflects the subjective judgments of the user. The story does not proceed in that manner exactly, but a similar idea is communicated, with the judging eye merely being one possible absolute alongside different possibilities, different suggestions. The ultimate implication seems to be that there is no real absolute, and that the Dunyan are merely following their nature, which leads them to assume there is an absolute in the first place. This might be further confirmed by the revelation that Kellis was not necessarily in control all along. While Kellis believed that he was going to enslave Hel in massive circumstances in that way, it turns out that Ajokli, the trickster god, seemed to be the one in real control. Bakker is not exactly clear with how this control manifested. Was Ajokli completely in control, or did Kellis strike a deal? Or was Kellis using Ajokli? And how often was this manifest? If Ajokli was controlling Kellis, was it just in the Ark, where Hel most strongly resides, or was he using Kellis throughout the story? The Unholy Consult does not answer this for us. And there are questions to ask about Kellis too. Like, don't you think he would expect to be taken advantage of? Perhaps he planned for this in some respects. So there is some uncertainty here. The final confrontation also reveals who the No-God is. It starts with the Consult claiming that Kellis was the No-God, as his Dunyain brethren try to reason with him and convince him to take up his role. When this initial reveal came, I had mixed emotions. It seemed to confirm the theory I had posed before, based on the naming scheme of Bakker's Super Series trilogy. The fact that Bakker thought the title of the No-God series was a spoiler was also what made me think that this was the answer. But I was also kind of disappointed. I don't entirely know why that was. Maybe the fact that I expected it made it seem like the simple answer. I don't know. But then, Kellis wasn't actually the No-God. The reason Kellis heralded the second apocalypse was because his son, Chucky, was the No-God. This is yet another twist that seems so obvious in retrospect. But after scanning through my review of The Great Ordeal, there does not seem to be any discussion of this possibility. I certainly remember hearing of the possibility, but for some reason I never took it all that seriously. I guess it might have something to do with my assumption that Chucky and the No-God were simply parallels in terms of the philosophical principle being touched upon. Kind of like how the Aeolus and Chucky shared that parallel while lacking any other connection. It also probably has to do with the fact that Chucky seems to have dual consciousness, which isn't the same thing as a philosophical zombie. And since I mentioned philosophical zombie, I'm beginning to realize that this quote-unquote spoiler, as I called it, seems to be more of a fan theory than a direct idea coming from Bakker. I doubt that Bakker will be all that explicit with it, but I am now considering the possibility that the No-God was never intended to be a philosophical zombie at all. Maybe Bakker has another idea in mind, something connected to that dual consciousness. The fact that the previous No-God was Nakayutis should also make us question whether that previous Anasirimber had some kind of dual consciousness. Basically, we just don't understand what or if there's an ultimate purpose to this choice of characterization. This is not really criticism, but I am a little let down that we don't know much, if anything, about the No-God. The reason seems obvious, of course. The entity has only just been introduced, and the next series is literally titled The No-God, so I imagine some of the deeper discussions are being saved for that later story. I also laughed when Bakker described the Consult Dunyain's moment of realization. They see Chucky gloat about being invisible to the gods and just looked at one another like, would you look at that? Before I move on to talk about the very ending of the book, I want to have another indulgent discussion about the metaphysics of Bakker's world and its relation to ethics. Basically, I think I would join the Consult. I know how that sounds, but let me explain. I promise I'm only marginally evil. But seriously, something that possessed me in the beginning of this book, admittedly because of the metaphysical discussion in The Great Ordeal, is that my stance on a lot of these issues are not exactly in line with whatever Bakker's characters seem to take for granted. But you really have to dig beneath the heaps and heaps of depravity to understand any of this. The Consult are characterized by a certain sexual energy that makes them among the most sickening villains in any book series that I have ever read. At the same time, Bakker adopts the inverse of most authors who want to make their stories morally gray. While other authors tend to shade their villain toward the white by giving them sympathetic motivations, Bakker only slightly does this, instead choosing to shade the good guys toward the black such that they would be the villain in any other series. In fact, are they the villain of this series too? Kinda. Once you get past the disturbing elements, is that a good thing? You might eventually ask yourself, which side would you actually be on if you were cursed to be in this world? The first considerations are the wanton violence and the gross sexual energy of the Srank and the Inkori. But it doesn't take long to recognize that humanity is not all that different. Perhaps not to the same degree, but Bakker really does take it close. As I have already discussed, there is an entire section of this novel where humanity basically becomes shrank, and this was all necessary to get the Great Ordeal to Golgotharoth. As I asked as far back as my Darkness review, what untold atrocities can be justified in the name of stopping the apocalypse? Eventually, you think beyond the tactics of either side, understanding that they are close enough in character, and you have to consider the goals. The Consult seeks to close off the world from the outside, stopping the gods from damning theirs and others' souls. They have to instigate an apocalyptic event to do this, however. And then Kell seeks to stop the apocalypse, though the ending suggests that he mainly wants to dominate Master Hell itself, and he is willing to engage in whatever wanton brutality he needs to in order to achieve this end. And in the Great Ordeal, we find that there is a wider context to all of this. The gods are impossible to please. They damn nearly everyone in existence, and this is not even necessarily for reasons of justice, though that might be the story surrounding it. The gods are entities that feed off humanity. They damn souls for the purposes of consumption, also they can feed off people's suffering. The Consult, then, is in opposition to that. The assumptions of Bakker's characters are largely that it is selfish and morally reprehensible to want to save one's soul from damnation. And the characterization of the Consult might confirm that, as they seem to primarily operate on the assumption that people will want to save their own soul. Though that might just be a pragmatic recruiting process, to be fair. It's also worth mentioning that Kels is hardly motivated by altruism either, and wanting to stop the apocalypse is not necessarily altruistic as well. You can do it to save yourself other than for others' sake. Regardless, one of the basic assumptions of the characters in this book is that the gods are just, and that the Consult is evil for wanting to escape this justice. And this is where my own view of the situation really starts to skew sharply away. I have many hot takes and philosophical atom bombs that I have to carefully drop with discretion. One is about the ethical nature of the gods in the afterlife. I have very esoteric ideas about ethics, but I won't bore you with the details. What matters are two implications of my view. One is that I reject the idea that the gods can provide a moral foundation even if they do exist, so the question of atheism has no bearing on ethics. The second and more important implication has to do with the afterlife. The general idea is that if there is a god or gods, and if they have the power to create and or send us to an afterlife as a punishment or a reward, then any ethical theory purporting this as just ultimately collapses into a might makes right theory of ethics. I reject deities as a moral foundation, and the key thing that distinguishes a deity from a human being is their capacity to send souls to one afterlife or another, or at least that's one key thing. As such, what a disagreement between these two conscious entities ultimately comes down to is the fact that one deity has power over their subjects. It is the only reason anyone even takes the gods seriously in the first place. They have the power to send you to hell, and that alongside an assumption of self-interest is the ultimate reason people follow them. People rationalize their moral frameworks within the incentive structures they find themselves within, even if this incentive structure is divine and immutable. You can point out that the gods create their subjects, but if we can question anything, then why not the idea that we are subject to our creator? Technically, parents are the creators of their children, yet most would not suggest that children are always subject to their parents, especially once they grow into adulthood. It's easy to think of exceptions. Tywin and Tyrion Lannister, for example. And does the capacity to create someone necessarily imply that they also have the capacity to act as their moral judge? The word capacity is also being used again, not arbitrarily. The suggestion is that the power to create someone means that power should be extended such that they can act as a moral judge and then eternally damn them. Ethics based in the divine is a variant of might makes right ethics. This seems rather obvious to me, at least, and with the backdrop of Bakker's metaphysics, it is rather easy to accept given that the gods are just part of the eternal cycle of consumption and excretion. But my suggestion goes beyond that. Religious people miss that their ethics is ultimately just might makes right, something they likely reject in name, because they just so happen to agree with the values upheld by the proposed gods. After all, their gods hold the right morals, and the gods of Bakker's universe do not, relative to their standard. The problem with saying this is that it necessarily supposes an ethical standard over and above the gods, something that they themselves are evaluated relative to. If the gods are the ultimate ethical standard by their very nature as the creator of all things, then it is logically impossible to even conceive of an immoral god. We can only conceive of a god that doesn't align with our personal ethical standards. This philosophical diatribe ultimately just means that I have no reason to bow to the gods in Bakker's universe in the first place, and that is because I don't think might makes right is a legitimate way to ground values. Indeed, depending on what my own personal values are, I might even conclude that the gods are the real oppressors. It's just too bad I have to commit genocide in order to oppose them, I guess. But like Kells can justify almost any atrocity in order to stop the apocalypse, what might I be able to justify to oppose arbitrary eternal suffering? There is power in base savagery, in the desire, let alone the will and capacity, to commit monstrous acts. All violence is equally ancient. To match a wicked foe abomination for abomination was to whisper in his ear while he slumbered. For the righteous were no more potent than when they were ruthless also. But holy shit, I'm not done. This does seem to highlight one key difference between Kellis and the Consult. Kellis is the embodiment of pragmatism. His atrocities serve some end, though that seems less so the case for the Consult. There really is no end to justify the sexual energy of their minions. They did not have to make the strength that way. At the same time, while I just made the case for why the Consult might have an end goal worth fighting for, I can point out that Kellis might not have an end goal worth fighting for after all. What does dominating hell mean? So what does this come down to? Kellis uses means only insofar as they serve his end. The Consult is a bit more flashy with their means, yet Kellis has a terrifying end in mind that will likely make things worse for humanity and everything, and the Consult's end is something that I find to be more respectable. Of course, they are all just Dunyang and they just want to dominate everything. The very assumption that any of this serves anything other than the continuation of the cycle is a cute thought. To live is to consume and to exude, to excrete and to chew, to turn upon 1,000 hidden alchemies, roomy transformations of what we lost into what we abhor or love. This is the last section of the review/discussion, finally. For the most part, this is just a scattering of discussion about the final pages. Nair comes to mind first. As he appeared in the previous book, we get to see more of him in this one. At the beginning of the Unholy Consult, we get to see Moengus snap from the stress of being tortured while in Ishternbinth. This is particularly expounded by the fact that Sarah was the one they were trying to break, and she did nothing to stop the torture. He abandons Sarah and Sorwheel after the latter two have sex, and he ends up with the Sylvendi and his true-blooded father. I think there was one major thing from Nair that stood out to me. Had they faces like fingers, you would cry out for swords and fire. But no, they possess souls like fingers instead. Their perversion can only be guessed, argued, never seen. Like what we've seen from this variant of the philosophical barbarian trope so many times before, he provides excellent insights into the world and the characters that Bakker has written. But the main reason I brought up Nair in this section is because of the last scene that we get with him. We get to see him go full Sebelwald, charging into a horde of strength, buck-ass naked, and going apeshit. Before him, the no-god thunders forward, ripping through the landscape. Nair, seemingly possessed, is somewhat ambiguously killed in the end after failing to see the no-god in the midst of the whirlwind. The reason for Nair's inability to see the no-god is most likely due to his possession by Jockli, who has his own bone to pick. While Nair hates the Anasarimber line for his own reasons, Jockli has also just failed after Chucky caused the death of his last host. This pairing goes on a rage-filled rampage to confront the no-god, only to succumb to the whirlwind of death. Apparently, this is the first scene that Bakker thought of in the entire Second Apocalypse series. The series was quite literally built around this scene. I'll have to admit that the scene doesn't hit me in quite the same way as it probably did Bakker. I find it rather interesting that it was this scene of all scenes. I guess that's how it is. There's another brief thing that happened before Nair's walk that has to be mentioned. Nair leaves the Sylvandi under the charge of Moengus, despite everything. But this scene's perspective is what stands out. For some reason, Bakker chose to write this scene in the second person, referring to Moengus as you. And there is no immediate explanation or reason. I'm left with only questions, and I'm not sure if I even have much speculation to add. What I can say is that the second person is only used in a Kellis chapter in The Great Ordeal, from what I remember. Except this prior use is not as blatant and is even less clear. There is a head on a pole behind you, and it cannot be moved. The only connection I can think of between these two scenes is the trickster god Ajokli, though he is only hinted at in the Kellis chapter. Bakker seems to have something in mind, but we will have to see. I will be on the lookout when I reread this series. This book has the ultimate futile ending. Kellis affects this elaborate plan, so well thought out, and he is killed in the last moment in the blink of an eye. All because he decided to keep his killer son alive for the sake of his wife. And he himself admits that he's breaking the rules for her. As we all feared that this incarnation of brutal pragmatism might be the most terrifying thing of all, it turns out that his failure to strictly adhere to this principle was what ultimately led to his failure to stop the consult. Even worse, when you think about the events in a broader sense, you begin to realize that the only way in which the consult managed to get their hands on Chucky and put him in the carapace was because of Kellis' effort to destroy Golgotharoth. If Kellis hadn't launched his great ordeal, Chucky would never have been discovered, nor would he have been captured. The very effort to stop the apocalypse helped bring it down upon them. Knowing Bakker, this was absolutely on purpose. The only question is whether this is a mid-arc low point of the series, or if things are going to get a whole lot uglier in the future. Bakker suggested that Kellis was dead but not done. There are two ways in which this might be interpreted. One is that Kellis' children will carry out the rest of his plans and potentially stop the No God before it kills everything. Or at least most people. How many are going to be left? Like 144,000 people. Similar to how the console incorrectly concluded that Kellis was the No God when it really was his son, his other children might be functional extensions of himself. The second interpretation is that Kellis created a contingency for himself in his scheming to take over Hell. The idea that he wouldn't at least try to do this seems rather ridiculous. Maybe Ajokli will have a part in this. Maybe the fact that Ajokli switched to Nair in a seeming rage suggests not. Or maybe the answer is a mixture of these two possibilities. So did the great ordeal of Anasarimber Kellis perish, insult and butchery. This was the longest review/discussion that I have ever written. I don't apologize. It was a right and proper indulgence, as with all things I do. Overall, I love the book and series. I think it beats out The Warrior Prophet, which was my previous favorite in the Second Apocalypse series. I think I will give it a 9 out of 10.